In this video, I'm going to introduce the organization of a Windows Form application project and show you how to create one in Visual Studio. Now, a Windows Form application project is organized a little bit differently than a console application project. What we're going to be doing when we build a Windows Form application is we are going to be creating a form class. And we're going to be creating a form class that inherits from the .NET system.windows.form form class. So we're inheriting from a form class, and we're going to make our own version of that form class. Our form class file is going to be divided into two parts. And so we're going to see these things called a partial class. A partial class is a class that is defined throughout multiple multiple text files. And half of this class file we are going to be responsible for writing the logic inside, and the other half is going to contain auto-generated code. So when we build a Windows Form application, Visual Studio is going to be writing half of our code for us. We are also going to have a program.cs class. So our program class is going to have a main method inside, and that main method is simply going to instantiate our form object, and that's it. So the program is going to build our form object and display it to the user, and then we are responsible for creating the logic that describes how does our form work, how does our form handle user interaction. Now the names of a lot of these views and class files they're confusing because they use the same types of words. So let me walk through each of them. We are going to see a form1.cs file in our project. The form1.cs file is the file that contains the code that we are responsible for. So inside this form1.cs file, we are going to create methods that handle event occurrences. We can create our own helper methods. We can create our own fields in the class, properties, etc. The default constructor is going to be inside our form, so we can handle what happens when our form is initialized by the application. Then we are going to have a form1.designer.cs file. Now the form1.designer.cs file is going to contain auto-generated code. In particular, there's going to be a method called initializeComponent, which contains a bunch of code that sets up the initial look of our form. Now we should not have to write any code inside this designer form, but it's good to understand what's being written for us behind the scenes. Now finally, there's going to be a Form1 design view. The design view is going to have a graphical user interface that we can drag controls onto, like buttons, labels, text boxes, etc. And we're going to be able to scale these controls and move them around and change their properties and colors and values. And so we have this view where we can set up the initial look of our form, and any change we make in the design view is going to result in code being written in the form1.designer.cs file. So the changes we make in the graphical user interface result in code being written for us in the form1.designer.cs file. Alright, let's look at creating a project in Visual Studio. So here I have Visual Studio. I'm going to say File, New Project. And under my Visual C# options here, I should have a Windows Form app template. I'm using the .NET framework here. This Windows Form app project is going to set up our initial files. It's going to create our Form1 class file, which inherits from the form class, and set up it's going to link some namespaces that we may find useful. So I'm going to go ahead and give this project a name. I'm going to call this, how about our first form, and click OK. Alright, so let's see what we have here. So instead of seeing some C# code by default, I get this form1.cs design view. Remember, the design view is where the user can kind of change values, properties, add elements, move them around, and we can kind of graphically design what we want our form to look like. But let's look behind the scenes. So in our Solution Explorer, we see we have a program.cs file and a form1.cs file. Now if I click on this program.cs file, here I see my main method, just like in when we built console applications, but I have 3 lines of code that's already written for us. And these two we're not concerned about those. What I should look at is this application.run method. And inside this run method, I'm instantiating a new form1 object. So I'm calling the default constructor from a form1 class. We aren't going to write any logic in the main method here. We're going to leave the program.cs class as it is. Now, to see the code from the form1.cs file, I can open it up a little bit, and I can see that there's a form1.designer.cs file as part of this form1 class. I'm going to right-click on the form1.cs file and click View Code. Here we see the code for the form1.cs class. This is the file we are responsible for. I see that the form1 inherits from the form class. So we are building a form object or a class from another kind of the standard default form. This is a partial class, meaning that this form1.cs file only contains some of the form definition. Our form1 class is going to also exist in another file. And here I have a default constructor set out for us. So the public form1, this is our default constructor, and the default constructor is calling a method named initializeComponent. Now we haven't created this method, we have to find it. So going back to the program.cs file, when I create my new form1, what's happening is this form is being constructed and initialized by calling this method. Now let's look at the form1.designer.cs file. So the form1.designer.cs file is also a partial class for our form1. This is the second half of our form1 class definition. And we have some auto-generated code here, but in particular I want to open up this little hidden section that says Windows Form Designer Generated Code. And inside this generated code, I have a warning that says, required method for designer support, do not modify the contents of this method with the code editor. And I suggest you follow their instructions. So inside this auto-generated code, we see our initializeComponent method, which we are calling in our half of the class. And in this initializeComponent method, I see some setup going on here. All right, we have 4 lines of code inside the initializeComponent method. Let me show you that if I go to Design View, well, let me introduce the Properties tab. This Properties window down at the bottom right of our Visual Studio contains an editor that allows us to interact with any properties that are defined in the control that is selected. So if I select the form1 itself, I can go down here and modify any property of this form. Now I can list all of the properties in a categorized view, or I can list them all alphabetically. Sometimes listing by alphabetically can help you find certain properties. But for example, look up here on the top left. I see that there's a name form1 on my form. Well, if I come down here, I notice there's a text property of this form1, and I'm going to change this to say my first form. When I change the property in Design View, I see that text property value has changed right here. Now it says my first form. And if I go to my form1.designer file, I now have a line of text or a line of code that's been added. This.text equals my first form. And this line of text was added to my initializeComponent method. So any change I make in Design View should be reflected by code that's generated for us in the designer.cs file. And that code will be called when I instantiate my form. And my default constructor calls this initialize component method. Let's do one more example. I'm going to select my form, and let's change the background color for a moment. So I'm going to find a background color property, and I'm going to change it to, let's just find something a little more interesting. How about yellow-green? Kind of painful for the eyes, but we can work with this. So when I change the property value in my design view, if I go over to my form1.designer.cs file, I should see a new line that's been added that says this.background color is equal to the color.yellow-green. So again, any change I make in design view is modifying the code in form1.designer, which is then going to be called when the form is initialized. Now let's run our form for a moment. When I click run or start, I'm compiling my code, and the program.cs file is going to run, and what it does is it is instantiated this form object that I see here. Now a form object is a window. That is, I can move it around. It has a minimize option, a maximize option, and a close option. And I can see that the text property of my form is displaying here. The background color is showing. And what we're going to learn how to do next is add controls to our form class, and then learn how to interact with those controls. But hopefully this gives you a brief introduction on how the Windows Form how a Windows Form application project is organized and how we are going to start interacting with it.